Elmswood was the kind of town where nothing ever changed. The same faces filled the cobblestone streets every morning, and the same whispers of old rumors danced through the air like the breeze that rustled the leaves of the towering oak trees. But on that fateful day in early October, something new came to town. It began with the sound of distant music, faint and haunting, drifting on the wind as if carried from another world. The townsfolk paused in their daily routines, heads tilted in confusion. The music was unlike anything they had ever heard, both enchanting and unnerving, like a lullaby sung in a minor key. By midday, the first signs of the carnival appeared on the outskirts of town. Brightly colored tents, their fabric frayed and weathered with age, rose from the fields like ghostly apparitions. The air around the carnival grounds buzzed with an unnatural energy, making the hairs on the back of one's neck stand on end. The people of Elmswood, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and unease, gathered at the entrance. A large, weather-beaten sign arched over the gate, its letters faded and peeling, but still legible. The Grand Carnival Sideshow. Beneath the sign, the gates creaked open as if on their own accord, beckoning the townsfolk to step inside. "Strange time of year for a carnival," muttered Mr. Thorne, the town's butcher, as he eyed the entrance warily. His wife clutched his arm, her eyes wide with apprehension. "I heard it just appeared overnight," she whispered, as if speaking too loudly might draw the carnival's attention. "No one saw them set up. It was just there." Despite the murmurings of concern, the allure of the unknown proved too strong to resist. One by one, the townspeople filed through the gates, their breath held in anticipation of the wonders and oddities that awaited them. Inside, the carnival was a world unto itself. The music grew louder, wrapping itself around the visitors like an unseen force, pulling them deeper into the labyrinth of tents and attractions. The air was thick with the scent of burnt sugar and something else. Something metallic, almost like blood. The ground beneath their feet felt soft and uneven, as if it were not solid earth, but something more sinister. Children ran ahead, laughing and pointing at the strange, contorted faces of the painted clowns that seemed to leer at them from every corner. Adults followed, their eyes darting nervously from shadow to shadow, as though they could sense something was not quite right, but couldn't put their finger on it. At the heart of the carnival stood the largest tent, its once vibrant stripes now faded to a dull crimson. A figure emerged from its shadows, a tall, thin man dressed in a tattered ringmaster's coat, his top hat tilted at a rakish angle. His face was pale, almost unnaturally so, and his eyes gleamed with a cold, predatory light as they scanned the crowd. "Welcome! Welcome!" The ringmaster's voice boomed, echoing through the carnival grounds. His words were smooth, like honey laced with venom. "Step right up, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Prepare yourselves for sights and sounds beyond your wildest dreams, or your darkest nightmares." The crowd shifted uneasily, but no one dared to move away. There was something about the ringmaster that held them captive, an invisible thread that wound tighter with every word he spoke. "The Grand Carnival Sideshow is not for the faint of heart," he continued, his smile widening to reveal unnaturally sharp teeth. "Only the bravest souls dare to enter, and only the bravest souls survive to tell the tale." A hush fell over the crowd. The music, once so alluring, now seemed to take on a discordant tone, grating on their nerves. Yet, despite the mounting dread, an inexplicable thrill coursed through them. The ringmaster held out his arms, gesturing toward the entrance of the main tent. "Come," he urged, his voice low and hypnotic. "Come and see what the night has in store for you." With a sense of foreboding that they could not shake, the people of Elmswood followed him into the darkness, unaware that they were stepping into the jaws of a nightmare from which they might never escape. The inside of the tent was a world apart from the sunlit grounds of the carnival. Darkness enveloped the space, broken only by the flickering light of gas lanterns suspended from the ceiling, their flames dancing in a way that made shadows stretch and twist unnervingly. The air was thick with a musty, stale scent, like an old attic that hadn't been disturbed in decades. The crowd clustered together, their eyes straining to adjust to the dim light. The ringmaster stood at the center of the tent, a spotlight casting his elongated shadow across the canvas walls, making him appear larger than life. He was a figure out of time, his clothing a patchwork of forgotten eras, a tattered waistcoat that might have been elegant a century ago, striped trousers faded to dullness, and boots caked with the dust of countless journeys. His presence dominated the room, an aura of authority and something darker that prickled the skin. The townsfolk of Elmswood had never encountered anyone quite like him, and their curiosity mingled with an instinctive fear. There was something about his eyes, deep set, with pupils that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. When he looked at them, it felt as though he could see straight into their souls, laying bare their secrets and fears. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice as smooth and velvety as before. But now there was an edge to it, a hint of something sinister beneath the surface. "You have chosen to step into a world where the ordinary is left behind, and the extraordinary becomes your reality. Here, you will witness marvels beyond comprehension, and horrors beyond imagination." The audience shifted uneasily. Mrs. Thorne, still clutching her husband's arm, felt a chill run down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that they had made a terrible mistake by coming here, but the ringmaster's words held her in place, as if he had cast some sort of spell over the entire crowd. "Allow me to introduce myself," he continued, sweeping off his hat and bowing low. "I am Anton Malvado, your humble guide through the strange and wondrous. But be warned, what you see tonight is not merely a show. It is a journey, one that will take you to the very edge of sanity and back." As he spoke, the flap at the far end of the tent opened, revealing another performer, a woman tall and willowy, draped in tattered silks that flowed like water as she moved. Her face was painted white, with dark, hollow eyes and lips the color of dried blood. She moved with an unnatural grace, her limbs bending and twisting in ways that seemed impossible, as though her bones were made of something other than flesh and marrow. "This is Serafina," Malvado said, gesturing to the woman. "Once the most renowned contortionist in the world, she now performs for you, her final audience. Watch closely, for her act is not one of mere physical prowess, but of a soul bound to the very fabric of this carnival." Serafina's eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to fixate on each member of the audience in turn, her gaze unsettlingly direct. Then, without warning, she began to move, her body folding in on itself in ways that defied logic. Gasps erupted from the crowd as she twisted her torso into impossible shapes, her spine bending backward until her head nearly touched the ground. But it wasn't just her physical feats that caused the gasps. It was the way her skin seemed to stretch unnaturally, her joints making faint popping sounds that echoed in the silence. There was something wrong about the way she moved, something that spoke of a terrible pain hidden behind her haunting eyes. As Serafina continued her performance, Malvado's voice grew quieter, taking on a more conspiratorial tone. "Each of our performers has a story, dear guests, a story of tragedy, of lives cut short, and of spirits unable to move on. They are bound to this carnival, to me, and now, to you." A nervous murmur rippled through the crowd. The reality of what Malvado was saying began to sink in. The performers weren't just entertainers. They were trapped, cursed souls doomed to perform the same grisly acts night after night for eternity. And if the audience wasn't careful, they might just find themselves joining the ranks of the damned. "Look closely," Malvado whispered, his eyes gleaming with malevolent delight. "For tonight, the line between performer and spectator is thinner than you might imagine, and once crossed, there is no turning back." The tent felt smaller, the air thicker, as the townsfolk realized that they were not merely watching a show. They were part of it. Their hearts pounded in their chests as Serafina's performance reached its climax, her body contorting into a final, impossible pose that left her head twisted backward, eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. With a flick of his wrist, Malvado brought the performance to a close. Serafina collapsed to the ground, her body limp and lifeless, as if whatever force had animated her had suddenly been drained away. The audience was too stunned to react, their minds struggling to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Malvado straightened, his smile returning as he regarded the crowd. "And so, the show begins," he said softly. "This is only the beginning, my friends. The night is long, and there are many more wonders and horrors yet to come." With a dramatic flourish, he gestured toward the next tent, where faint sounds of distant laughter and eerie music could be heard. "Please follow me. The next act is one that is sure to chill your blood and steal your breath. But be warned, once you enter, there is no turning back." The crowd hesitated, but as Malvado turned and began to walk, they found themselves compelled to follow. The eerie atmosphere pressed in around them, the oppressive sense of dread deepening with each step. The ringmaster's words echoed in their minds, filling them with a growing sense of terror that they could not shake. The path ahead was shrouded in darkness, and as they ventured further into the heart of the carnival, one thing became increasingly clear. This was no ordinary sideshow. It was a place where the living and the dead coexisted, where reality and nightmare blurred, and where the price of admission might very well be their souls. The townsfolk followed Malvado through the narrow pathway between the tents, their footsteps muffled by the soft, uneven ground beneath them. The eerie music played on, its melody growing fainter as they moved deeper into the carnival, yet it clung to the air like a ghostly whisper. The flickering lights of the gas lantern seemed to dim with every step, casting the world around them into a murky twilight. Ahead, another large tent loomed, its entrance covered by heavy, blood-red curtains that billowed slightly as though stirred by an invisible breeze. Malvado paused before them, his pale face framed by the shadows, and turned to address the crowd once more. "This, dear guests, is where the tale of our carnival truly begins," he said, his voice soft, almost reverent. "What you are about to see is not a mere performance, but a glimpse into the past, a past stained by tragedy and loss. I must warn you, what you will witness may unsettle you, but it is a story that must be told, for it is the very essence of our existence." The crowd exchanged nervous glances, but there was no turning back now. Malvado stepped aside, pulling the heavy curtains open with a slow, deliberate motion. The townsfolk hesitated only a moment before they entered the tent, the darkness swallowing them whole. Inside, the air was thick and stale, the scent of decay mingling with the acrid stench of burnt wood. Lanterns hung from the ceiling, their flickering flames casting long shadows across the ground. At the center of the tent stood a makeshift stage, its boards splintered and worn, as though it had been hastily constructed and left to rot over time. The atmosphere was oppressive, laden with the weight of something terrible that had transpired long ago. Malvado appeared on the stage as if from nowhere, his presence commanding the attention of all. "Years ago," he began, his voice low and solemn, "this carnival was very different. It was a place of joy and wonder, where people came from far and wide to be entertained by the most extraordinary performers the world had ever seen. But as with all things, such happiness could not last." He paused, letting his words sink in. The crowd listened intently, a sense of dread creeping into their hearts. "The performers of this carnival were more than just entertainers," Malvado continued. "They were a family, bound not by blood, but by the hardships and triumphs they shared. Each had their own unique gift, their own talent that set them apart from the rest of the world. But it was these very gifts that led to their downfall." As Malvado spoke, the lanterns above dimmed, and the shadows around the stage seemed to thicken, as if the past was coming to life before their very eyes. Faint outlines of figures began to materialize on the stage, ghostly apparitions of the performers who once graced it. There was Serafina, the contortionist, her body moving in an eerie, rhythmic dance. Next to her was Victor, the strong man, his massive form towering over the others as he lifted weights that seemed impossible for any mortal man. And beside him, a pair of twins, Helena and Hugo, whose identical faces were twisted in expressions of sorrow. "These were the stars of our carnival," Malvado said, his voice tinged with melancholy. "Beloved by all who came to see them. But fate can be cruel, and it was on a night much like this one that tragedy struck." The ghostly performers began to move, acting out the events of that fateful night. Serafina bent herself into impossible shapes, her movements more frantic than before, as if struggling against some unseen force. Victor lifted his weights, his face a mask of concentration, while the twins performed a delicate balancing act, their movements perfectly synchronized. But something was wrong. The air in the tent grew colder, and a sense of impending doom hung thick in the atmosphere. The performers' movements became more frantic, more desperate, as though they were no longer in control of their own bodies. Serafina's spine twisted unnaturally, Victor's arms trembled under the weight he once lifted with ease, and the twins stumbled in their delicate dance. The accident that befell them was no mere mishap, Malvado intoned, his eyes darkening with the memory. It was a curse, one born of jealousy and malice, a curse that bound their souls to this place, forever repeating the moment of their demise. As if on cue, the stage seemed to come alive with the sounds of the past. The creaking of wood, the shouts of panic, and the sickening crack of bones echoed through the tent, sending shivers down the spines of the onlookers. The lanterns above flickered violently, casting the scene in a macabre light as the performers' final moments played out before the horrified crowd. Serafina's body twisted grotesquely, her face contorted in pain as her spine snapped with a loud crack. Victor, struggling under the weight of his massive barbell, let out a guttural cry as his legs gave way, the barbell crashing down on him with a sickening thud. The twins, their hands clasped tightly together, slipped from their precarious perch, their bodies tumbling to the ground in a lifeless heap. The ghostly forms collapsed, their final cries of agony echoing through the tent before fading into silence. The stage was empty once more, save for Malvado, who stood at its center, his expression unreadable. "And so, the carnival became their prison," he said quietly. "Their souls, unable to find peace, lingered here, trapped in the moment of their death. They are bound to this place, to me, and now, to you." The silence in the tent was deafening. The townsfolk stood frozen, their faces pale with shock and fear. They had come seeking entertainment, thrills, and perhaps a few harmless scares, but what they had found was something far darker, The weight of the tragedy hung over them, a palpable force that pressed down on their chests, making it hard to breathe. Malvado stepped down from the stage, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "You have seen the truth of this carnival," he said, his voice carrying a note of finality. "But there is still more to discover, more secrets hidden in the shadows. I invite you to continue your journey, if you dare." He turned, gesturing toward yet another tent, its entrance shrouded in darkness. The townsfolk hesitated, the horrors they had just witnessed still fresh in their minds. But the pull of the unknown was strong, and despite their fear, they found themselves drawn to the next stage of the sideshow. One by one, they moved toward the tent's entrance, their steps slow and tentative. The story of the tragic accident played over and over in their minds, each detail more horrifying than the last. As they crossed the threshold, the air around them seemed to grow colder, and the sense of dread deepened. They had stepped into the carnival seeking entertainment, but now they were part of something much larger, something ancient and cursed, where the lines between life and death, reality and nightmare were forever blurred. The night was far from over, and the horrors that awaited them would only grow more intense as they delved deeper into the heart of the ghostly Carnival Sideshow. The cold air seemed to thicken as the townsfolk of Elmswood stepped into the next tent. A deathly silence enveloped them, broken only by the sound of their hesitant footsteps on the dirt floor. The darkness inside was near absolute, the faint flicker of lanterns at the edges barely piercing the oppressive gloom. It was as if the light itself was reluctant to touch this place. They gathered in a loose circle, every face tense with a mixture of dread and anticipation. The night had already shown them more than they ever expected to see, yet there was no turning back. Something had gripped their collective hearts, a compulsion, a need to see this terrifying journey through to its end. At the center of the tent stood a raised platform, covered in a dusty, threadbare curtain. Malvado appeared beside it, his movements smooth and silent, like a shadow slipping through the dark. His presence commanded their attention, and once more the ringmaster's voice filled the air, wrapping around the crowd like a velvet noose. "Welcome, my dear friends, to the heart of our carnival," he intoned, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to resonate from the very earth beneath them. "You have witnessed the tragic past that binds our performers to this place. Now you shall see them as they are, forever trapped in their cursed roles, their souls twisted by the horrors of their final moments." With a flourish, Malvado pulled back the curtain, revealing what lay beneath. The townsfolk gasped, their eyes widening in disbelief and horror. The platform was filled with grotesque displays, each more unsettling than the last. At the forefront was Serafina, her body contorted into a nightmarish pose, her limbs bent at impossible angles. Her eyes, wide and lifeless, stared blankly ahead, yet there was an eerie flicker of awareness in them, as if some part of her was still conscious, still suffering. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream, her once beautiful features now twisted in eternal agony. Beside her stood Victor, the strongman, his massive form slumped under the weight of the barbel that had crushed him in life. His muscles, once a source of pride and strength, were now swollen and grotesque, bulging in unnatural ways that made his skin stretch and tear. His face was a mask of pain, his eyes bloodshot and bulging as if he were still struggling to lift the impossible weight that had ended his life. The twins, Helena and Hugo, were posed together, their bodies entwined in a macabre embrace. Their identical faces, once cherubic and innocent, were now gaunt and hollow, their skin pulled tight over their skulls. They clung to each other, their eyes locked in a gaze of shared terror, as if they were reliving their final fall over and over again in their minds. "These, my dear guests," Malvado said, his voice a cold whisper, are the true faces of our performers. They are not merely the entertainers you saw in life, but the tortured souls they became in death. Their talents, their gifts, have been twisted by the curse that binds them here, turning their performances into eternal punishments. The crowd recoiled, their initial curiosity giving way to revulsion. Yet, there was something mesmerizing about the display, a dark allure that held their gaze even as their instincts screamed at them to flee. Suddenly, the lanterns flickered, and a new sound filled the tent, a low, eerie hum that vibrated through the very air. The grotesque figures on the platform began to move, their jerky, unnatural motions sending fresh waves of terror through the crowd. Serafina's limbs snapped and cracked as she twisted into even more impossible shapes, her mouth moving as if she were trying to speak, but only a faint, rasping sound emerged. Victor's barbell began to tremble, the enormous weight straining his broken body as he lifted it with agonizing slowness, his face contorted in a rictus of pain. The twins clung to each other even tighter, their heads turning in unison to face the crowd, their hollow eyes filled with an unspoken plea. The townsfolk backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The tent, once large and spacious, seemed to shrink around them, the shadows closing in as the horror intensified. Panic set in, breaths coming in quick, shallow gasps, the need to escape growing more desperate with every passing second. But the worst was yet to come. From the darkness at the edges of the tent, other figures began to emerge. More performers, each bearing the marks of their own gruesome demise. A fire eater whose charred skin cracked and split as flames licked at his lips. A sword swallower whose throat bulged grotesquely, the outline of a blade visible beneath his skin. And a juggler whose severed hands floated in the air, tossing phantom balls with an eerie precision. Malvado watched with a cruel smile, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You see," he said softly, "there is no escape from the curse. These souls are bound to the carnival, their suffering eternal. And you, my dear guests, have been chosen to witness their torment, to join them in their endless performance." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The townsfolk tried to move, to run, but their bodies felt heavy, as though the very ground beneath them had turned to quicksand. The performers closed in, their twisted faces filled with a hunger that was more than just physical. It was as if they were trying to drag the living down into their nightmare to share in their endless pain. Suddenly, a loud metallic clang echoed through the tent, breaking the spell. The performers froze, their grotesque forms twitching as if caught between two worlds. The sound repeated, louder this time, like a bell tolling the hour of doom. The crowd turned toward the source of the noise, a small, rusted door at the far end of the tent, partially hidden behind a tattered curtain. The clang came again, and the door creaked open just a crack, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. Malvado's smile faltered for the first time, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his face. The performers, too, seemed to recoil from the sound, their movements becoming more frantic, more desperate. "That door," Malvado hissed, his voice suddenly filled with a venomous anger, "is not for you. It is not part of the show." But the crowd, driven by a primal fear, didn't listen. The clang sounded again, and with it came a strange, irresistible urge, an instinct that told them the door was their only chance of escape. Ignoring Malvado's furious shouts, the townsfolk surged toward the door, pushing and shoving in their desperation. The performers lunged after them, but their grotesque forms seemed to weaken with every step closer to the door, as if the very presence of the exit was sapping their strength. The clang sounded one final time, and the door swung open, revealing a yawning abyss of darkness. Without thinking, the first of the townsfolk hurled themselves through the opening, followed by the others in a mad scramble to escape the horrors behind them. As the last of the crowd disappeared through the door, Malvado's furious screams echoed through the tent, mingling with the anguished cries of the performers. The door slammed shut with a deafening finality, and the tent was plunged into silence once more. The darkness swallowed them whole, and the next part of the nightmare began. The darkness was suffocating, thick and all-encompassing, as if the very air had turned to pitch. The townsfolk stumbled blindly, their hands outstretched, desperately searching for something, anything, to hold on to in the void. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, panic bubbling up from their chests as the reality of their situation set in. There was no light, no sound, nothing to orient themselves. It was as if they had stepped into another world, one where the very concept of time and space was distorted beyond recognition. The only thing that guided them was the memory of Malvado's furious screams and the sense that they had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. But as they moved deeper into the darkness, that fleeting sense of relief began to fade. The air grew colder, the ground beneath them soft and uneven, shifting underfoot like the skin of some immense, slumbering beast. The feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes following their every move, was almost palpable. Mrs. Thorne's voice was the first to break the silence, trembling with fear. "Where are we? What is this place?" No one had an answer. The darkness swallowed their words, leaving only the sound of their hurried footsteps and the growing sense of dread that gnawed at their minds. Suddenly, a flicker of light appeared in the distance, faint and wavering like a candle flame caught in a gust of wind. It was a beacon in the blackness, and without hesitation, the townsfolk moved toward it, their steps quickening in desperation. As they drew closer, the light grew brighter, revealing a narrow corridor lined with mirrors. The glass was old and tarnished, streaked with dirt and grime, but it reflected the flickering light with an unsettling clarity. The corridor stretched on for what seemed like miles, the mirrors creating an endless tunnel of distorted reflections that twisted and warped with every step. Mr. Thorne, leading the group, paused at the entrance of the corridor, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch the nearest mirror. His reflection stared back at him, its eyes wide with fear. But there was something wrong, something off. The reflection's mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, teeth unnaturally sharp, as it raised a hand and beckoned him forward. He recoiled in horror, his hand snapping back as if the glass had burned him. "We need to find another way," he said, his voice shaking. This isn't right." But there was no other way. The darkness behind them was impenetrable, and the corridor ahead, though filled with distorted reflections and unsettling images, was the only path visible. Reluctantly, they pressed on, moving deeper into the mirrored maze. The walls seemed to close in around them, the reflections growing more twisted and nightmarish with every step. Faces stared back at them from the glass, their features stretched and warped, eyes gleaming with malevolence. Sometimes the reflections moved out of sync with their real counterparts, lagging behind by a fraction of a second, or grinning when no one else was. As they ventured further, the sense of disorientation grew. The corridor twisted and turned in impossible ways, doubling back on itself, leading them in circles. The mirror seemed to mock them, reflecting their fear and confusion, amplifying it until it was all they could see. Helena, one of the twins, broke into a run, her hand clutching her brother Hugo's tightly. "We have to get out of here," she cried, her voice echoing unnaturally in the narrow space. But no matter how fast they ran, the corridor stretched on endlessly, the mirrors multiplying around them, reflecting not just their images, but their deepest fears and darkest secrets. Mrs. Thorne, glancing into one of the mirrors, saw herself as an old woman, frail and withered, her eyes sunken and hollow, the life drained from her body. She let out a strangled cry, stumbling backward, but there was no escape from the reflections. They were everywhere. The light that had guided them began to flicker, growing dimmer with each passing moment. The darkness crept in from the edges of the corridor, pressing closer and closer, threatening to swallow them whole. The mirrors, once mere glass, now seemed like portals to another world, one filled with nightmares and horrors beyond comprehension. Just when it seemed the corridor would go on forever, they reached a dead end. A single, massive mirror blocked their path, its surface perfectly smooth and polished, reflecting their haggard, terrified faces back at them. But there was something else in the reflection, something that wasn't there in the real world. Behind them, in the mirror's reflection, the distorted figures of the carnival performers began to materialize. Serafina, Victor, the twins, and the others, each twisted and broken in their own way, emerged from the shadows, their ghostly forms moving silently toward the group. Their eyes were empty, hollow, and their faces bore expressions of agony and rage. Mr. Thorne turned to look behind him, but the corridor was empty. Yet in the mirror, the performers drew closer, their forms growing more defined with every step. It was as if the mirror was showing them a vision of their future, one in which they too became part of the carnival, their souls twisted and bound by the same curse that had claimed the performers. No, this can't be happening," Mrs. Thorne sobbed, pressing herself against the mirror as if she could somehow escape through it. The mirror responded to her touch, the glass rippling like water. Her hand sank into it, and for a brief, terrifying moment, she felt as though she was being pulled into the mirror itself, into the world where the performers dwelled. She jerked her hand back, her breath coming in frantic gasps. The others pressed against the mirror, desperate to find a way out, but the glass remained solid, trapping them between the endless corridor of reflections and the approaching horrors in the mirror. The performers in the reflection were nearly upon them now, their twisted forms filling the mirror, their hands outstretched, reaching for the living. "Please, let us out!" Helena screamed, pounding on the glass with her fists, but the mirror remained unyielding. The light flickered once more, then went out entirely, plunging the corridor into total darkness. The only thing left was the mirror, now glowing faintly with an unnatural light, illuminating the twisted reflections of the performers as they closed in. And then, with a sound like shattering glass, the mirror exploded outward, shards flying in all directions. The impact knocked the townsfolk to the ground, their screams drowned out by the deafening roar of the collapse. For a moment, the world was nothing but chaos and noise. When the dust settled, the corridor was gone, replaced by a vast open space that stretched on forever in every direction. The darkness was thick, impenetrable, but the faint outlines of the carnival tents could be seen in the distance, distorted and twisted, as if viewed through a broken lens. The townsfolk lay scattered on the ground, dazed and disoriented. They had escaped the corridor, but the carnival had not let them go. The performers' laughter echoed around them, a low, mocking sound that sent chills down their spines. Slowly, they got to their feet, their bodies aching from the fall. There was no sign of the mirror, or the corridor, or even Malvado, but the sense of dread remained, stronger than ever. They were still trapped, still part of the carnival's nightmare. And now, they were more lost than ever. With no other choice, they began to move toward the distant tents, the only landmarks in this twisted, endless landscape. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with unseen horrors, and the hope of escape had faded to a distant memory. But there was no going back. The carnival had claimed them, and there was no escape that didn't lead them deeper into the darkness. The vast, dark expanse that surrounded the townsfolk was oppressive, a void that seemed to swallow all hope and light. The faint outlines of the carnival tents in the distance were their only guide, distorted and shifting as if not entirely real. The air was heavy with the stench of decay and the lingering echoes of laughter, cruel and mocking, as though the carnival itself was alive and toying with them. They moved as one, a huddled mass of fear and desperation, their steps unsteady as they navigated the uneven ground. Every sound, every whisper of wind or distant creak set their nerves on edge. But they pressed on, driven by the primal urge to survive, to escape this nightmare before it consumed them entirely. As they drew closer to the tents, the air grew colder, each breath turning to mist before their eyes. The darkness seemed to thicken, pressing in on them from all sides. But it wasn't just the darkness that unnerved them. It was the feeling that they were being watched, hunted, by something lurking just beyond their sight. Finally, they reached the first of the tents. It loomed above them, its once bright colors now faded and stained, the fabric fluttering weakly in an unseen breeze. The entrance yawned open like the mouth of some great beast, waiting to devour them. Mr. Thorne, his face pale and drawn, took a deep breath and stepped forward. "We have to go in," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "There's no other way." The others hesitated, but with no alternative in sight, they followed him inside. The interior of the tent was dimly lit by a single flickering lantern hanging from the center pole. The air was stifling, filled with the scent of old dry straw and something far more foul, rotting flesh, perhaps, or the decay of forgotten time. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting into shapes that seemed almost human before melting away into the darkness. In the center of the tent, under the weak light of the lantern, stood a figure draped in shadow. It took a moment for their eyes to adjust, but when they did, the townsfolk recoiled in horror. It was the ringmaster, Anton Malvado, his tall frame now towering and grotesque. His face, once pale and sharp, was now a mask of rage and malevolence, the features stretched and distorted, as if the very skin of his face was trying to pull away from the bone. His eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, no longer human, but something far older, far darker. "Welcome back, my dear guests," Malvado hissed, his voice low and venomous, reverberating through the tent like the tolling of a funeral bell. "Did you think you could escape my carnival so easily? Did you believe you could outrun your fate?" The townsfolk shrank back, but there was nowhere to go. The tent, once a small, contained space, now seemed endless, its boundaries stretching into oblivion. "You have seen the horrors of this place," Malvado continued, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "You have felt the cold grip of fear and despair. But you have not yet faced the true terror, the force that binds this carnival together. The force that binds me." With a wave of his hand, the lantern above flickered wildly, its light casting erratic shadows across the tent. The ground beneath them rumbled, and the very air seemed to vibrate with the dark energy. From the shadows at the edges of the tent, the twisted forms of the carnival performers began to emerge, their faces twisted into masks of pain and fury. Serafina, Victor, the twins, and the others, they were all there, their ghostly forms radiating a cold, malevolent hunger. "This carnival is a prison," Malvado intoned, his voice rising with a fevered intensity. "A prison for souls cursed by their own desires, their own sins. And you, my dear guests, have been chosen to join them, to become part of this eternal performance, or death is but a prelude to the torment that follows. The performers moved forward, their eyes locked on the terrified townsfolk, their hands outstretched as if to drag them down into the same abyss of suffering they themselves were trapped in. The air grew colder still, and the darkness pressed in, smothering, as though it were alive and hungry. But just as all hope seemed lost, a sudden voice broke through the oppressive silence. A voice clear and strong, filled with a defiance that cut through the dark like a blade. "No!" It was Helena, her small form standing resolute at the front of the group, her hand clutching her brother Hugo's tightly. "We won't let you take us. We're not like you." Her words hung in the air, a beacon of resistance in the face of overwhelming terror. The others, drawn by her courage, began to stand taller, their fear giving way to something stronger, a resolve to fight, to resist the pull of the carnival and the fate Malvado had planned for them. Malvado's eyes narrowed, his twisted smile fading. "You think you can defy me, child?" he snarled, his voice a low growl. "You think your will is stronger than the curse that binds this place?" Helena met his gaze, her eyes burning with determination. "We won't become like them," she said, nodding toward the performers. "We won't be trapped here forever. We will find a way out." Malvado's expression twisted into a mask of fury, and with a bellow of rage, he gestured toward the performers. "Take them," he roared. "Drag them down into the darkness where they belong." The performers surged forward, their movements swift and predatory. The townsfolk braced themselves, but this time, they were not defenseless. Helena's words had sparked something within them, a fire, a strength that refused to be extinguished by fear. Mr. Thorne grabbed a nearby wooden beam and swung it at the nearest performer, Serafina, who recoiled as if struck by something far more powerful than mere wood. Mrs. Thorne, her fear replaced by a fierce protectiveness, threw a lantern at Victor, the strongman, the glass shattering and flames licking at his ghostly form. The twins, Helena and Hugo, clasped hands, their bond a symbol of defiance as they stared down the ghostly twins who mirrored them. For a moment the performers faltered, their forms flickering as if struggling against some unseen force. Malvado's furious roars filled the air, but they were no longer the only sound. The townsfolk's defiance was growing stronger, their determination to survive driving back the darkness. But Malvado was not done. With a snarl, he raised his arms, and the tent itself began to tremble. The ground beneath them cracked and split, revealing a yawning chasm filled with swirling shadows. The very fabric of the tent seemed to come alive, the walls closing in, the ceiling collapsing, as the carnival itself tried to devour them. "Do you see?" Malvado shouted, his voice filled with a manic glee. "Do you see the power I wield? You cannot escape it. You cannot defy it." But even as the tent began to collapse around them, Helena's voice rang out once more. "It's not your power," she cried, her voice strong and unwavering. "It's theirs. The performers. You're the one who's trapped, not us." Malvado froze, his expression shifting from fury to something else, something like fear. "The curse binds you to this place," Helena continued, her words filled with a strange, undeniable truth. "The performers, they control the carnival, not you, and we can break that control." The ground beneath them continued to tremble, but the performers had stopped their advance. They turned toward Malvado, their ghostly eyes narrowing as if they were seeing him for the first time. The air grew thick with tension, and the darkness seemed to retreat slightly, as if the carnival itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Malvado's face twisted in a snarl of rage. "You foolish child!" he spat, his voice trembling with fury. You know nothing of the forces at work here!" But the performers were no longer listening to him. They began to circle around Malvado, their ghostly forms growing more solid, more real as they closed in. It was as if Helena's words had broken something within them, some spell that had kept them bound to the ringmaster's will. "You're the one who's trapped," Mr. Thorne said, stepping forward, his voice filled with newfound confidence. "Not us. You've been using their pain, their suffering, to keep yourself in power. But now they know the truth." Malvado backed away, his confidence faltering. "No, this can't be," he stammered, his voice losing its commanding tone. "I am the master of this carnival. I control—" But his words were cut off as the performers lunged at him, their ghostly hands grasping at his twisted form. Malvado screamed, a sound filled with pure, unbridled terror, as the performers dragged him down into the chasm that had opened beneath his feet. The ground swallowed him whole, his cries fading into the darkness as the earth closed over him. The tent shuddered, the walls rippling as the fabric of the carnival's reality began to unravel. The performers, now free of Malvado's control, began to fade, their ghostly forms dissolving into the air like mist in the morning sun. But their expressions were no longer twisted in pain and rage. They were peaceful, relieved, as if they were finally being released from their torment. The townsfolk stood in stunned silence, watching as the last of the performers vanished into the ether. The darkness that had suffused the carnival began to lift, the air growing lighter, the stench of decay dissipating. The tents around them crumbled, collapsing into dust as the curse that had bound the carnival unraveled completely. For the first time since they had entered the carnival, the townsfolk could see the sky, a clear, star-filled expanse that stretched out above them, free of the oppressive clouds that had hung over the carnival. The nightmare was over.